Okay, there we go.
Oh, yeah. There's only a small group too, so if you have a question or whatever, just feel free to unmute and speak up.
So we're going to talk about creating a podcast.
I have a
And
little experience doing that.
we've done it, yes. So we'll talk about concept, format, and identity, basically things you should think about before deciding whether to start one. The materials, equipment, and services, and then how to promote it and measure the impact of it once you start it.
Do you want to talk the link to the
Yes, and
slide deck in the chat?
and let's put that was what I already had saved that. And because we were ready and waiting, but no one was here. So
in here, we have 3 really helpful resources that you can save and use later. So one is a press book that John and I have been writing and Anna, that kind of walk you through using how to set up a podcast and what have you. We also created a Google Doc, which is a podcast planning worksheet that we've used in a couple of presentations that really walks you step by step from how you conceptualize one to publishing it and maintaining it. And then we also have a budget worksheet if you were trying to get grant funds or something to get the equipment and things together that you need.
and we encourage you to click on those links. The last 2, I think, will create the documents in there, and the other is a link if you want to create a podcast you may want to save, because it does have some useful information. So maybe we could start with any question, any thoughts from people on what, if they are interested in creating one, and what the focus would be, perhaps.
Yeah. Does anyone here, Chris, Marcia, or Sarah, have something specific that you were thinking about making your podcast in? Or about?
We have had a podcast in the past. I haven't been part of it. So Lizette Alvarado asked me to join today so I can kind of hear what you guys have to say, and then hopefully we can pick up with the podcast we used to have and start it again.
International education, right?
Yep.
This is Marcia. I've never done a podcast before, but I've had students create like video logs of their travel, and I thought I would use the information here to get students to create a podcast to talk with parents. So I'm teaching a math methods course, and I wanted to help them create a podcast to talk to parents. So.
That's great.
And I'm here mostly because I'm interested in looking at equipment and revamping the multimedia rooms that are in the library that are available for students to use to create media such as podcasts. And then the second thing that we've been talking about in the library, we've kind of been joking about this, is doing some kind of like history, like library history podcast. And some of us have watched the Only Murders in the Building show, where they do a podcast. And anyway, so we've talked about like interesting things about SUNY Oswego history in this podcast. So that's kind of more of like, it's not, that one's probably not going to happen, but we will be doing improvements to the multimedia production rooms.
Well, if it does happen, just don't kill people in the buildings.
I promise that will not be part of it.
So the first thing you should do when you're thinking about a podcast is think about these questions. The first is, what do you know about, or what would be a good thing for you to focus on?
And it sounds like you all have, good strategies here already. But these are also opportunities to think about domains that you work in, but you might want to learn more about, or where there's gaps or needs. And some of the examples that you all shared are maybe some gaps in understanding, or an audience that maybe needs to be reached. So you're well underway in brainstorming things.
And these are all good things to focus on. So we can move forward. I think we've had a lot here.
So when you're really thinking about a podcast or anything that you're going to publish and share out with the world, it's really helpful to have a really clear concept and a clear idea of who your audience is, so that you're able to reach who you're hoping to reach, and distribute it in ways that will reach that particular audience. So once you kind of determine the focus or theme of the show, and, you know, in some cases, you know, maybe it's about, you know, traveling and places you might get to travel to, for example, maybe that's the general theme. Then you want to think about what are the goals or objectives of the show. Really, it's no different than, you know, designing a syllabus. Like, what's the major idea? And then what are the objectives that you're hoping the show is going to accomplish? And then the real key question that I think is often overlooked is really honing in on the audience. My experience as a designer, right, working with students and designing all kinds of things, is that everybody wants their audience to be everyone. And as soon as you try to do that, your message is diluted. So you want to think really about what's your niche audience, or what are some characteristics of your audience? Are they beginners? Are they experts in whatever the topic is? Are you trying to convince them of something? Is it, you know, are they in a particular part of the world? Is it a global audience? All of these factors really play into maybe the kinds of things that you might do on your show.
So one of the next things you have to do is come up with a title. And we struggled with that a bit. We actually reached out, we got a few suggestions. We ended up going with T for Teaching, and we did check to see if there was any issues with domain names. But we forgot to check Twitter, and it turned out there was someone with the handle of T for Teaching on Twitter. So we were never able to get that Twitter handle. So make sure you do all those things once you have a name, but look at options, do a search to see if anyone else has used that, because you don't want to pick a name that would be confused with someone else. Although we did have someone come up a couple of years into ours and adopt, they took our title and they added a prefix to it, which was, I think, Teacher T's, T for Teaching, if I remember, or something like that. They may not have been aware of ours, but you don't want to confuse people and have people going to the wrong.
T for Teaching was mine before I even got here. It was a program that I ran before I was out of Vigo, so. I don't know how everybody got these titles before, but the other thing to kind of pay attention to, I know Marcia, you were talking about having a project with students. One thing you can think about is like, what's the overall podcast title that would be a way of unifying multiple episodes from multiple creators that you might be able to recycle over and over again, rather than every time being a brand new project and a brand new title. There might be a way to really plan upfront so that you have more of this longevity of what you're doing.
And if you want to make it easier, ask the students to come up with ideas, have them submitted in a forum or a discussion forum, and then put it up to a vote. In my class, they came up with the title Ozonomics, which has been used for all the class podcasts I've used. And I told students, once it's there, you can't change it, because that's how people will find it. That's how it's listed on the servers and so forth. So, you know, pick a name that you're going to be happy with and that will fit anything you're likely to be addressing, so that it, you know, people can easily find it. So the next thing you need to do is think about materials. And we have a lot of information in that book about possible combinations. But you do want to have decent microphones. The most important thing in terms of the audio is having a good microphone. And there's some things you should avoid. Never, for example, use a headset microphone. The sound from those is extremely poor. They have tiny microphones. They don't pick up lower frequencies very well. They put the microphone right in front of your mouth and you get all these plosives. It makes for a really horrible listening experience. But a good microphone, a wide diaphragm microphone in particular, is pretty helpful. You may also want to have stands for the microphone so that they're not sitting on a desk or a table where people might be tapping them. We're typing on a computer and doing other things, all of the sounds of which will be picked up through vibrations from the microphone. And you may want to have, if possible, shock mounts for those microphones, so that if they do get bumped, it's not going to sound like an explosion somewhere.
And specific examples of those items are in that book that we provided the link to, so they can kind of explore some specific choices.
And you also need some type of mixer interface, unless you have a USB microphone. The problem with the USB microphone is that on many computers, older computers in particular, you can't have two of them at the same time. So you essentially have to have a microphone that can be shared between, if you have two or more people recording in the same room, you need one with a good omnidirectional setting or perhaps a bidirectional setting, so it picks up in the front and the back. But those often will be more sensitive to other types of sound. So it really helps to have a good mixer and an XLR mic, which are the ones we have in each of the rooms that we've been running the workshops from. So if you've been in any of the rooms, you've seen those. Basically, it's just a different type of cable. It plugs into an interface, and that interface, that mixer interface, plugs into the computer, usually as a USB interface.
And if you're just starting out, right, then you can start with relatively inexpensive materials and, you know, upgrade as you invest in the podcast first.
And if it's students doing the podcast, they can simply use their smartphones, and that will give reasonably decent recording quality. But if you do want to go a little higher up, there are some inexpensive options, but it does cost us a little bit more. You also need to determine how you're going to edit it. If you're working on campus, you can get a copy of Adobe Audition from CTS. And that is a really powerful editing program. In fact, it's one of the most commonly used ones by professional podcasters.
But it also has a learning curve.
It does have a little bit of a learning curve. It's relatively straightforward. There's other free software tools. If you're a Mac user, you could use GarageBand to edit, especially if you're already used to that. There's also, there's a number of free programs, and we describe those in the book.
And Audacity is another free one that's common that people use, but
Yeah.
that's really easy to use. And very quick to instruct students on, you know, in a 10-minute lesson, you can easily figure out how to get sound in there and how to cut it.
And the book also has some descriptions of how to do some of the basic editing tasks, both in Audacity and in one you just mentioned.
Audacity and Audition.
Audacity in addition, I'm sorry. Okay,
Here's the one on the-
yeah.
The other thing you want to think about is that there are some, if you're going to publish your podcast, often you need some graphics to go with it. So you might want to think about graphic design. So is there an icon that you're going to use? Are you going to have headshots of guests if you have guests or things like that? So there's some things that you want to think about upfront in terms of consistency. And then you have to decide where you're going to publish your website, you know, or publish your podcast, whether or not that's going to be on a website using a podcasting service. We use Podbean, or if you're going to use something free. What's the one?
There was Acorn, and it has a different name now. There's a number of them. And we do describe those sites and put links to them in the book. So there are some free ones. And actually, all of the major podcast hosts have some free options, but they limit the number of downloads or the total number of uploads or the number of podcasts you can publish each month. Going back to recording, if you're only going to be recording in person, you don't really need much in the way of software. If you're going to be recording remote guests, you could use Zoom. The audio quality will be a bit lower, you know, and so there's a number of levels you can get there. The best software is one where it's recorded locally on each person's computer and uploaded. And there's several options for that we also mentioned in the book.
You also, if you want theme music, you know, you can license theme music. Sometimes you can get licenses that are free, or you can pay for licenses. The costs vary depending on where you're getting them from. We have a few places to suggest to get the theme music in the book, but the key is remember that you must get a license to put music and things in your podcast. You can't just publish it because that would be a copyright violation. So do make sure that you have an appropriate license for any music that you're doing.
And we did pay for a license for our music. I think it was something like $35 or $50 for, but we can only have the use of it for 50 years. So if the podcast goes beyond that, it would have to be renewed with whoever created that music. But there's a lot of free Creative Commons music or license under Creative Commons music.
So we already mentioned a little bit about needing a podcast hosting site or service. That can just facilitate kind of scheduling when the podcast come out, and as well as distributing to major podcast software. You know, so for example, if it's going to be at Spotify or Apple Podcasts or things like that, a podcasting hosting site can facilitate that much more seamlessly than to do things as one-offs.
And it's pretty much all automatic, that once you sign up for it, you just go through the posting service to connect to the other sites. You have to fill in a little bit of information, but once you've done that, it automatically gets released to often dozens of different servers.
Yeah.
And you also want to provide transcripts to maintain accessibility. And there's some free tools out there. We use Otter.ai, which has an annual fee of like, it's like $100 or so, maybe a little bit more than that. But it generates much higher quality transcripts than you get with many of the free services.
But also, if you're using Zoom, you've got the ability to access the transcript right away. You can download those. Or, on campus, we also have access to Panopto, which has relatively decent captioning, and then you can download a transcript from there. The key is just like when you're doing any kind of captioning or something like that, is that the automated captions are okay, but you need to human read them to make sure they're accurate.
Yeah, and that can take a bit of time. It generally takes me 3 to 6 hours to edit a transcript based on a relatively high quality one. And some of it's partly putting in the breaks between things. Sometimes it misidentifies the speakers and so on. We initially just used YouTube. We created a video with just an image and the podcast recording behind it, and then we let YouTube generate it. The only problem with that is it didn't identify the individual speakers, and that's a useful part of a transcript, because knowing that there's a stream of words there isn't that useful when you don't have any way of identifying which person said those words.
But using YouTube is a way that some people distribute, a really low cost way that you could distribute episodes, for example, in a class.
And some people do distribute the podcast as videos as well. We don't, because we like to edit things and clean up all of our mistakes before it gets released. And we have a lot of jump cuts in that.
We never make mistakes.
Not in the final version. And then, the remote recording service that I briefly mentioned before are services you can pay for. They vary in price, but basically it allows you to get high quality audio from each person. You can edit each person's audio separately and then mix it all down together so that you can get somewhat higher quality recordings, and you can make a nice stereo field where you have some people seating on the right, some on the left, and so forth. And it just sounds a little bit more realistic, as if you're in the room with the people who are recording.
This is usually an area of both that kind of startup materials and ongoing materials that people have questions about. So right here might be the moment to pause and see if there's any questions. Are there any questions about any of these sorts of materials or services that you have specific questions about? Do you have the book up? We could show what that
We
is.
do. If we go to the book here, it's so tough presenting from one screen. Okay, because of the Zoom control. Here's the book, and if we click on read book, you see the chapter breakdown. Kind of should be listed there. We'll have to get her in there. We didn't have her information, that was why. So we have one section on planning, what we've already talked about, podcast recording. And this gives you some information on the hardware you might use, so locations, hardware, and mentioning the location, try to find a place that's quiet, where you're not going to get a lot of extraneous noise. We first started trying to record this in the Celt office, and we have the blenders and the coffee machines and the espresso machines, and we have that cart that goes by and it sounds like a train 7 or 8 times a day. And we have students right outside the office waiting in line, and they can be fairly loud, and it's all picked up. So we ended up finding a different location. Finding a good quiet location is helpful. One thing that really helps though is finding a room that does not have bare walls and that does not have a tile floor. You want something to be sound absorbent so you don't get, it doesn't sound like you're recording in an echo chamber.
When we went remote, I was recording from my home design studio, which is, largely blank walls because I hang things up on the walls to do design work. And it was so echoey. I ended up flipping my desk around so that I was facing the bookcase on the other side so that there would be some absorption and not so much bounce.
And the ideal location is you have those sound absorbing pads, the thing that looks like A-crate stuff. But if not, just having bookcases can help. In the recording room we use in Lanigan, We have a green screen hanging in front of us because otherwise we had a glass wall that reflected all the sound back really nicely. Behind us, we had a large plaster wall, and we have a wall of computer screens on one side and metal on the other. So we covered some of those up with blankets or with curtains, drapes, and other things. You want something on the walls that will absorb sound just to make it sound a little bit better.
Maybe want to just look at one of these just to show like what some of the, so you can just see how this resource may be helpful. Explanations and definitions of different microphones, so when you're really overwhelmed and you're not sure what's what. There's specific examples and some explanation of what the differences are, so that you've got some support when you're making a decision about what to do. Any questions from anyone that we can help with?
I don't have any questions. I'm just enjoying what you guys are saying, just taking it all in.
I have a question.
Sure.
Would you be willing to do offer a field trip to see the studio you use in Lanigan?
Sure, it's kind of ugly. It's kind of like
It's kind
the
of
worst looking
Not a
thing.
good example.
Well, have you seen the
Maybe.
multimedia production rooms in the library? They're really bad right now, so we definitely want to improve them. So it's probably not uglier than what we've got right now.
But yeah, we'd be happy to show that at any time. So I've got a key to it. So, just stop by and,
There's also, a couple of recording studios on campus there that you may want to check out. There's some lower end ones, like the design department has a small low end, like ad hoc recording studio. That's, a low cost space. That might be worth looking at, but then also, broadcasting and music have a couple of recording rooms too, so you can see kind of different levels of being outfitted with materials.
And then the student radio station over in the campus center has some nice facilities.
Yeah.
And we do break it up by low cost options, low cost or free, medium cost and higher cost. And we've got updated. We've added a lot of new equipment since we last updated this about a year ago.
We can probably turn back to the,
The slides.
yeah.
Okay. So we do have a lot of information there, and we will periodically update that. And if you have any questions, just ask us.
The other thing that you want to be thinking about too, no matter what kind of podcast you're creating, is how you're going to reach your audience, and then how are they going to find out about it, right? So where are they already? So for example, when we first launched Tea for Teaching, a lot of professionals in the kind of instructional design and teaching center space were on Twitter. And so that was a really good place for us to promote. Now it's a little harder to find people, but that was an easy place. That was a place where we already knew there was a community that we could reach, as well as our local community, right? Like locally, we had our self-emailing list and other places where we could easily share out that information. Then you want to think about how do you know that your audience is receiving the podcast and they're engaging. If you're using some of these podcasting services, then there are ways to know how many people download and that kind of thing. John's a little obsessed with that on our end.
Well, and we originally started mostly for campus users. We mostly wanted to reach adjuncts and people who were teaching at multiple schools who didn't have time to be able to attend workshops or even to watch videos. But they did spend quite a bit of time back then driving from campus to campus. And this was a nice way of reaching people we wouldn't otherwise reach. And I think we were really surprised I was certainly surprised at how quickly it grew. So that we have thousands of listeners every month. I think our peak was close to about 12,000 or so right now. But within a year or so, we were up to 3,000 or 4,000 listeners a month, and then it just has kept growing steadily ever since.
The other thing to keep in mind is that you're able to embed, podcast episodes in places. So if you're for example, thinking about the international ed example, Chris, is that if you use a service like Podbean or something similar, you could easily get it out to all of the podcasting platforms, but then also have the ability to embed it in your website, right? For the department or other places where you're doing promo, like on social media.
And with a podcast service, you can get breakdowns by by country, by state, and so forth. And one thing that's really disappointed me the last year or so is that New York is not always or even often in the top states. Right now, we have more, this month so far, we have about 30–40% more listeners in Texas than we do in New York State. California is often above New York. Massachusetts is sometimes above. Kentucky 1 month was above New York. So our audience has grown. It's not that we have fewer people in New York. It's just that we've reached many more people. And one of the things that's been happening is a lot of schools have been doing podcast listening sessions where they have faculty listen to it and then come in and discuss it, or they play it during a workshop and development. We've tried doing it and no one showed up. So we haven't with other podcasts, but
You can imagine that if we're, you can think of places where whatever the topic is, where people are congregating, so you can promote it there. So, for example, if you're doing a podcast on comics or something, then you might get comic shops to, promote it by, having flyers or things available in those spaces with QR codes to really find it.
and a really good way to get things spread is to get some well-known people to join the podcast, because they will publicize it and other people will see that they're on it and they will share it with their networks. And during the first 3 or 4 months of COVID, I think we had 3 or 4 times as many listeners as we did right before that, because we were sharing a lot of resources from some really impressive people out there, and it just got a lot of attention. So finding people that beyond the podcast who are doing interesting work that other people know, if you do want to share it more broadly to reach a larger
And if you
audience.
want to do a different style podcast, there's lots of different styles
That's
that
true.
you can do, and some of those are outlined in the resources that we shared.
And actually, that's it. So, does anyone have any questions? We can go back and look at some of the other things in more detail, or we can look at some of those other documents. But are there any things you'd like to know more about? Because the last time we did this, we had trouble keeping it to an hour because some of us talked a little bit more about the hardware. One of us did. Okay.
Some of us being. The worksheet that we included at the beginning can really step you through all the stages as well. So that might be of use. So this walks through kind of all the stuff that we were just talking about with like prompting questions, etc. And if you wanted to use a variation of this for a class exercise or something, you're more than welcome to use it.
So these are all questions you want to think about. For example, one thing that really does help with a podcast is having a regular release schedule. Some only come out once a month. Most come out either weekly or every other week. And some people will shut down for the summer or during some period. But think about that, and a regular release schedule tends to help build listeners because people expect it at certain times, so they'll go looking for it.
But there's different ways, right? Like you could have a serialized podcast where maybe it's like the theme changes, or back on the like international idea, maybe it's one country and there's multiple stories, and then that's one season and the next season is something else. Like there's ways to organize things that make sense to others as well. And we also in this worksheet walk through the different kinds of formats that are pretty common too. And
so if you did want to kill off someone in the library, you might have a series of 4 or 5 podcasts investigating who was the murderer, for example, as in Only Murders in the Building, which is a great show, by the way.
One thing
Yeah, there's no murdering gonna happen in the library, just to clarify.
One thing that as we're just looking through, John, that's really important to think about, especially when working with students, is the copyright piece. And really thinking about who's listed as the copyright holder and whether or not individual, like the entire series is under a Creative Commons license. Just be aware that you may be restricted on what kind of Creative Commons license you use, depending on what your music license is, if you're using something like that. So that's actually one of the reasons why ours needs to be licensed the way that it is that our music license has some limitations on it.
Yeah, so we can't relicense that music to other people. Otherwise, we would just release it under CC BY license.
Yeah. Anything else we can help with, or other questions or things that you're excited about, or things that you're hoping to dig into?
I actually have a question. I was wondering if you guys ever do like hands-on workshops where you can come in and actually physically participate in creating a podcast. I know that sounds more like a class, but I was wondering if there's an opportunity to ever kind of participate in the creation of a podcast and actually see how it works from beginning to end.
We actually did that at CIT 2 years ago.
Yep.
It did take a while. It was a 3-hour workshop and it was a bit tight getting it in. But we could do that if there was enough interest. You know, we could even do it on multiple days.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Because we do have some extra equipment too, so what we did in that case is we took people through the same sort of thing we just did here, except we had them break up into groups, we sent them off into different rooms, and they recorded a short podcast, and then they came back and did some basic editing with it, so.
Just so they could figure out how to like record, edit, and put something together, right? And we didn't do anything for those little exercises.
But and in the book, we had examples of how they could edit, because with editing, there's a number of things you can do. One thing you want to do is make sure your volume is the same as podcast standards, and audio editing software does allow you to adjust the loudness. So that, you know, you don't want it to be much quieter than others or much louder, because then if someone's listening to podcasts and yours come in, they either have to crank the volume up or turn it down before they burst their eardrum and so forth. So, you know, those are the types of things that we've worked on in that, as well as removing different types of noises, removing filler words, and other types of content editing problems. The other one is, and related to the volume, is you may also want to adjust the volume of each person. If you're only recording a mono track with everyone together, there are tools available in editing software that will bring up the quieter people to make them a little louder, or to bring down the volume of the louder people so that everyone sounds the same.
Like you might not have ever noticed that I'm quieter than John.
On the audio, on the podcast, so she's
We're not.
just as loud, but it takes some adjusting to get into there.
Well, I'm really excited to, I'm probably gonna schedule a meeting with John and Rebecca and also Dustin, who's the CTS representative who works within the library. Because we are, as I said, we are revamping the multimedia production rooms, but for Marcia and Chris, once we have created a much better podcasting room, I will be sure to let you know that, because that's a resource that your students can use, or you could use to come and, you know, record a podcast. Like I said, we have to revamp those rooms now. They are available now, but they're, like I said, they're in need of some revamping, but we have 2 rooms that students, faculty or staff can come and check out and use those rooms. And you know, they're an enclosed room with some equipment in them. We have like a snowball mic, but I'm excited to have attended this presentation and do some follow-up with John and Rebecca and accelerate the improvement of our rooms. So thank you, guys.
And snowball mics are really good mics for the price. You can get them for like $40 or $50 for the basic one. It's like 70 or 80 for the more powerful one. And they're condenser mics, which is really good because you get really high quality audio. The only potential problem with them is that they'll pick up all the sound. So if there's some noise outside the room, it will pick that up too.
Which is like they're really good. I hear everything.
Right. The other type of microphone is, or another type of microphone is a dynamic microphone. And with a condenser mic, the signal that's being received is amplified at the source. With a dynamic mic, what happens is the sound that's created by them is being generated by the vibrations of the diaphragm in the microphone. And what happens is that fades really quickly with distance. So if you're in a noisier environment, a dynamic microphone is much better. It won't be quite as clear, it won't pick up the same frequency range, but it won't pick up noises outside the room as much, which sometimes is better. And that's most people who do podcasts from home who don't have a recording studio, you know, that's all soundproof, will tend to use that dynamic microphone.
But if any of you wanna follow up with either of us, I'm sure we can sit through and talk a little bit about what your goals are and help get through that a little bit and maybe tease out what parts of the resources we shared would be most helpful to you.
And Chris, if you want us to give a workshop on that, you know, remind me and we can schedule something, and we can do it on multiple days. You know, I could do some of it, you know, we don't have to both do all of it, but yeah, because it's kind of fun. We would still be doing it, 6 years later if it wasn't fun.
That would be wonderful. I'm also more of a hands-on visual learner. So it would be good to just kind of see how it all works and understand it a little bit more, like foot on the ground type of experience. That would be wonderful.
Okay. And I will try to remember that, but I might forget, so remind me.
Well, thank you so much for your time and attention, everyone. Hopefully the resources are helpful to you and feel free to use those however you like.
Thank you.
Thanks, it's great.
Thank you so much.
And by the way, if you click the start summary, you will see a summary of everything that's been said in the session. It's a new tool available in Zoom. Oh no, I thought I did. Oh, I know, we had to switch it because it went into Maggie's room because she had signed into this computer. Yeah, so never mind, it's not set up. I had set it up with the URL we started with. Sorry about that.
Next time.
Next time, for all the rest of the sessions, it should be turned on.